what would their answers be? I think Paul would say, no, not if by works you mean deeds done to show that you deserve God's ongoing blessing. And I think James would say, yes, if by works you mean the fruit and evidence of faith. Now those two answers, one was yes and one was no, both with a different qualification of the meaning of works, are not contradictory answers. No, justification as an ongoing declaration of my right standing with God does not depend on works of love. If works of love are seen as that which show you deserving of it, yes, they are necessary for that justification if you are understanding them as the evidence of the initial faith by which you are reckoned righteous. Let's try it again. Got 2 or 3 more ways here to see if we can say this in a way that will draw out its significance. When Paul renounces justification by works, he renounces the view that anything we do alongside faith is credited to us as righteousness. He renounces that. If you say, I got to do faith, and then I got to bring another thing in alongside of it at the beginning of my Christian life and offer it up to God so that He will now credit me with righteousness and accept me into His favor and impute to me His righteousness, Paul renounces that. It's not faith plus anything at that initial getting right with God. But when James affirms justification by works, he means that works are absolutely necessary in the ongoing life of the Christian to confirm and to prove the reality of the faith by which we were justified. And the way he chooses to say it is that that ongoing act of declaration is justification and is by works in the sense that the works evidence the faith and are necessary evidences of the faith. For Paul, justification by works, which he rejects, means gaining right standing with God by the merit of works. I'm going to say it as short as I can. For Paul, justification by works means gaining a right standing with God through the merit of works. For James, justification by works means, and he accepts this, maintaining a right standing with God by faith along with the necessary evidences of the authenticity of that faith. If you lose the necessary evidences of the faith by which you have a right standing with God, you don't have a right standing with God. And therefore the works of love are necessary as evidence of the faith by which alone God has reckoned you righteous. Let me try to put it another way. Last way. When Paul teaches in Romans 4:5 that we are justified by faith alone, he means the only thing that unites you to Christ is dependence on Christ. Or let me say it with one more phrase. The only thing that unites you to Christ for righteousness is dependence on Christ. If you get anything, get that. I think Paul and James are in agreement on that. The only thing that unites you to Christ when you enter the Christian life is dependence on Christ. Dependence alone on Christ alone is what is credited as righteousness. Now, in verse 24 of James 2, when James says that we are not justified by faith alone, which sounds like an absolutely blatant contradiction of what I just said on the face of it. When he says we are not justified by faith alone, he means the faith which justifies never remains alone, but always works by love. The faith which justifies never remains alone, but always works by love. And James, risking tremendous confusion on our part, was willing to use the words, I call that justification by works, and created 2,000 years of difficulty for the Christian church, so that Martin Luther called it an epistle of straw. I think it is a wonderful counter correction for a wild-eyed antinomian abuse of Paul's teaching, for people who don't see the correction in Paul himself. So let me close with this and draw attention to the glory of Christ in this way. The glory of Christ in the gospel. This is what, as I drew my preparations to a close yesterday, and I was pondering, okay, what's the bottom line in all of this? Where should I end, and what is all this pointing to? I think the answer is both Paul and James want very much for Christ to be glorified in the gospel. And I want that to happen in this service. I want it to happen in your lives. How does Christ get glory through these two angles on the gospel? The glory of Christ in the gospel is not merely that we are justified when we depend on Christ alone for our right standing with God. See, that is a glorious thing. And if I preached only that, it would be glorious. We are glorifying Christ when we teach that our right standing with God is by depending on Christ alone and not the slightest whiff of work. The best kind of work. We're depending on Christ alone, and that dependence we call faith. And so when faith rests in Christ alone, Christ is greatly magnified as the ground of our justification. But that's not the only glory of Christ in the gospel. Christ is also glorified in the gospel when we see that depending entirely on Christ is also the power by which we become new, loving people. You see, becoming new, loving people, like James is after in 2:14-26, becoming new, loving people is not performed or sought another way than by depending on Christ. That's what results in legalistic Christians. Legalistic Christians can't see that the way you begin the Christian life and get right with God is the way you live the Christian life, namely by faith alone. So we get right with God by faith alone. We say, I'm a sinner, I'm ungodly, I have nothing to offer the Lord. If I'm going to have any right standing with Him and be declared not guilty and the righteousness of God in Christ imputed to me and be forgiven and acquitted and accepted, I've got one thing I can do: fall on Jesus. That's all I can do. I can rest on Jesus. I can depend on Jesus. I can fall. If there's one thing a cripple can do, it is fall. And that's all that's required of us, is that we stop trying to stand on our own two legs and decide what's good for us and what's bad for us and how to get right with God and how to run our lives, and just fall on Jesus. Depend entirely on His righteousness and His power and His strength. And then if you ask, okay, I'm going to do that now because I'm desperate and I have nothing in myself, I'm going to depend wholly on Jesus. And you do that, and I declare you are thereby justified on the basis of the righteousness of Jesus, and God accepts you. And then you ask me, now what do I do? Tomorrow. And the next day. And the next day. And the glory of the gospel is that you go on living a gospel life. The same dependence on Jesus that got you right with God to begin is the dependence on Jesus that enabled Abraham to offer up the love of his life. I mean, how are you going to offer up the love of your life?